Have you ever felt like you're just drowning in information? Trying to really grasp a big historical event, but wishing there was just a clearer way to see what really matters.
Oh, absolutely. Information overload is real.
Well, that's exactly what we're aiming for today. We're going to take a proper deep dive into, well, a really fascinating and complicated story. British colonialism in East Africa during the 19th century.
A huge topic and incredibly impactful.
Right. So our mission, if you like, is to unpack how and why Britain got so intensely interested in this region. We'll look at the economic stuff, the strategic thinking, the actual systems they put in place to run
The
things.
administration, yeah. And the consequences, of course.
Exactly, the lasting effects. So for you listening, think of this as your shortcut to understanding a really crucial period, one that honestly shapes so much of the modern world. We're hoping for some of those, surprising facts, those aha moments.
Those moments that make history click.
Precisely. Now, before we jump back, let's just set the scene a bit. Define our terms. When we talk about colonialism today, we're using that broad definition: establishing, exploiting, maintaining, expanding colonies by people from somewhere else.
Fundamentally creating unequal relationships. That's key. Between the colonizer and the colonized land, or the colonists and the indigenous people.
Right. And the source material we're looking at even brings up this really thought-provoking idea that, maybe tragically, a sort of new type of colonialism persisted even after independence was achieved.
That's a whole other layer, the post-independence dynamics. Very important.
Definitely something to keep in mind. Just so we're all on the same page, when we say East Africa for today's deep dive, what are we actually talking about geographically?
Good question. We're basically looking at present-day Kenya, Tanzania, which back then included Tanganyika and sometimes references to Zaire and Uganda.
Okay, the mainland. And the islands, too.
Yes, absolutely. Key islands and coastal spots like Zanzibar, Mozambique, Mafia, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Pemba, they're all part of this story.
So geographically, what does that look like? Help us picture it.
Okay, so imagine this huge strategic area. You've got the Somali desert and the Ethiopian mountains up north. Then to the west, these massive lakes, Albert, Kivu, Tanganyika, Nyasa.
Great Lakes region.
Exactly. To the south, the Zambezi River forms a kind of boundary. And then, of course, the whole eastern edge is the Indian Ocean. It's about 1 million square miles, roughly.
Wow, that's vast.
It is, and it's described as looking like a plateau, mostly quite densely populated in parts even then. And its location, that geography, is why it became so incredibly important for European powers, especially Britain in the 19th century. It fundamentally changed things.
Right, the location is everything.
And what jumps out right away from the source material is this direct quote from Karl Marx. He said, colonialism presented capitalism in naked form, stripped of decorous clothing of European bourgeois society.
Wow, naked form. That's a strong image.
It really is. It highlights those raw economic drivers right from the beginning. The argument being that colonialism let capitalism operate without the social constraints or moral pretenses it might have back in Europe.
Stripped bare, essentially.
Exactly. And it gets even more nuanced. The source also touches on ideas from thinkers like Sartre and Fanon. Fanon, for instance, talked about different temporalities in the colonial world.
Temporalities, what does that mean in this context?
It's this idea of a time lag, you could say, a difference in rhythm and perspective between, for example, the Western-educated nationalist leaders and the more traditional peasantry living according to older rhythms.
Ah, okay. So not everyone experienced colonialism in the same way or at the same pace.
Precisely. It forces us to ask, how varied were the experiences within these regions? It wasn't monolithic. Understanding those internal dynamics is crucial.
That makes sense. Different groups, different impacts.
And connecting this to the bigger historical picture, it's quite striking. European empires peaked in the Americas in the 18th century. Foundations were being laid in the East. But there was surprisingly little direct European territorial activity in Africa itself for a long time.
Right. That seems counterintuitive, given what happened later.
It does, and that historical gap, that relative lack of early focus, is a really key piece of context we need to explore as we go deeper.
Okay, so let's rewind then. Let's trace how Europe's focus did eventually shift toward Africa. Because like you said, it wasn't the main game for a long time.
It really wasn't.
Despite how important it became later, Africa wasn't the prime target. Our source material actually points out that the earliest big European overseas expansion started way earlier, 15th century, in Northwest and West Africa.
With the Portuguese, primarily.
Exactly. The Portuguese were the pioneers, setting up trading posts, Arguin, Elmina, Sao Tome, places like that on the West Coast. And then the huge moment, discovering the Cape of Good Hope in 1487.
That changed everything. The sea route to the east.
It did. It pushed them to occupy existing East African ports too, like Sofala, Mozambique, and reaching all the way up to the Red Sea and Hormuz.
They were building a maritime network.
Right. And for a brief period, it seems, in the 16th century, it looked like Portugal might actually create proper territorial colonies, like in the Congo, Angola, along the Zambezi.
Following the Spanish model in the Americas, almost.
Yeah, the source mentions adventurers and missionaries acting a bit like the conquistadors.
Oh.
So the big question is, why didn't that happen? Why didn't this early push turn into a massive Portuguese land empire in Africa then?
That's the crux of it, isn't it? What held them back?
It sets the stage for everything that came later.
And what's fascinating is that it boils down to a definite shift in Portuguese priorities. Over time, the crown in Lisbon it lost interest in pouring resources into African exploration and conversion efforts.
Really? Why?
India and the East. They became completely consumed by the potential wealth and strategic value there. Africa, increasingly, was seen either as just an obstacle on the way to the Indies.
Something to get around.
Exactly. Or, maybe more practically, just a place to get gold dust, ivory, and, crucially, slaves for the American plantations.
So, resource extraction, but not necessarily territorial control.
Precisely.
No.
And the source makes a really telling point. Portugal showed no desire or capacity to develop its coastal bases into colonies. And interestingly, this wasn't just Portugal. Other European powers kind of adopted the same stance for a while.
Huh. So, content with coastal trading posts.
For a long time, yes.
Yeah.
The Portuguese and Arab traders pretty much controlled the key East African ports. Trade often happened through Portuguese firms buying temporary monopolies. And while slave duties brought in some revenue, especially in Angola, the source argues something quite insightful.
What's that?
That slaving, as the main economic activity, was often incompatible with territorial empire. It didn't encourage settlement or the kind of development seen later.
How so?
Well, the constant raiding and capturing of people often destabilized regions, discouraged settled farming, and created what the source calls a wilderness in places like Tanganyika and Zanzibar. It wasn't conducive to building a stable colony.
That's a really interesting paradox. The trade that drew them there also prevented deeper control.
In some ways, yes. Then, as we get into the 17th century, the power dynamics start shifting significantly. The Dutch begin attacking Portuguese shipping, seizing their vital bases in India and the East.
Cutting off their main source of wealth.
Exactly. At the same time, Arab forces expand down from the north, capturing ports north of Zanzibar. Inland, Portugal's allies, the Monomatapas, lose power. Mozambique technically stays the Portuguese capital, but their overall influence is clearly waning.
A definite decline, creating a vacuum.
A growing power vacuum, absolutely, which, down the line, creates opportunities for other European players, particularly the British.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Portuguese power is declining in the 18th century, but British influence starts creeping up, even though, initially, they kind of treated Africa the same way.
Right, same initial view. Slaves for America, obstacle to India.
And importantly, during this earlier period, Britain didn't establish any proper, directly run colonies. They mostly left the slave trade to private companies.
Paying rent to local rulers, often.
Yeah, exactly. But these early British ventures weren't smooth sailing either, were they?
No, the source points out real challenges. The slave supply could be irregular, and the African middlemen who controlled access to the supply.
They held the cards.
They did. They could inflate prices because they had a monopoly on meeting that demand. Plus, the source mentions the British company agents themselves were often unreliable and corrupt.
Doesn't sound like a recipe for efficient expansion.
Not at all. And the result? For almost 200 years, British activities in both West and East Africa produced no significant expansion of territory or influence.
2 centuries of relatively little progress on the ground. That really highlights how dramatic the 19th century changes were.
It's a stark contrast. It really sets the stage for that pivot.
Okay, let's unpack that pivot then, because by 1815, something clearly changed in Britain's approach. They weren't just trading or bypassing anymore.
No, a fundamental shift.
By then, Britain had established what the source calls genuine colonies in Africa. And crucially, these weren't mainly slave trading centers anymore.
That's the big difference, the abolition factor.
Right. Britain had officially abolished its slave trade in 1807. That had to change everything, the economics, the morals, the justification for being there.
It completely altered the calculus.
So a different kind of engagement started. I mean, even earlier, after the war with France, Britain had captured French bases in West Africa in 1758. But East Africa was different, still mostly Muslim-controlled, with Arabs building a powerful slave empire.
So even as others pulled back from the trade, Britain stayed, but with new reasons.
Exactly. The main driver, outwardly at least, became the suppression of slaving. That was number one. Developing legitimate commerce came second.
Humanitarian goals first, trade second. That was the official line.
And those two things, abolition and legitimate trade, really became the foundation for British activity in West Africa for the next 60 years or so. And by 1815, they'd started extending their reach into East Africa too.
Though the trade aspect there was still pretty small initially.
Right. Legitimate trade wasn't yet the main incentive for that early East African expansion. The empire was growing, yes, but its purpose there wasn't purely commercial yet.
It's interesting to see that strategic recalibration in action. When Britain started looking seriously at Mozambique, for example, they found Portugal was just too weak to really expand inland.
They couldn't project power effectively.
Right, and while Mozambique was useful for things like groundnuts, palm oil, the trade wasn't massive. And importantly, African middlemen were already supplying these goods. So why bother with costly direct colonization?
The existing system worked well enough for their needs at that point.
It seemed to. And looking bigger picture, after 1815, Portugal really held very little in East Africa, just Mozambique Island, a few forts, these semi-independent feudal estates called prazos up the Zambezi.
A shadow of their former presence.
Definitely. The source even says Portugal's empire had been decaying since the 1580s, losing bits and pieces right up to the 1820s. Meanwhile, most of East Africa remained under powerful Muslim sultans.
So what was driving European expansion there, according to the source?
Two main things are mentioned. First, the financial weakness of debtor sultans, suggesting vulnerability to economic pressure. Second, the reaction of Islamic nationalists to alien encroachments, local resistance building up.
Okay, internal weakness and external reaction.
But here's a crucial nuance. The source stresses that no sultanate actually collapsed due to bankruptcy in this period. This suggests early European investments might have been more spiritual and geographical rather than financial.
Meaning more about influence, prestige, strategy, maybe abolitionism than immediate profit.
That seems to be the implication. It wasn't purely about the money yet. British trade in East Africa was also way smaller than on the West Coast, and it didn't offer much scope for small farmers.
What kind of trade was it then?
Mainly luxury goods. Ivory, which needed professional hunters. Sugar from big plantations in Mauritius. Cloves from Arab-owned estates in Zanzibar.
Right, Zanzibar. That becomes key.
Hugely important. British political influence there relied heavily on a tricky partnership with the local Islamic oligarchy, the big landowners and merchants.
A necessary alliance, it sounds like.
But it was full of contradictions. Just like their diplomacy elsewhere, say in Constantinople, Britain wanted reforms based on their ideals: free trade, free wage labor, better treatment of people.
The humanitarian angle again?
Yes, but the government back home was always nervous about spending money, so they relied on these traditional rulers to implement reforms that were completely at odds with the rulers' own interests and their systems based on slave labor.
That sounds completely unworkable. How could they expect rulers to undermine their own power base?
Exactly. It raises big questions about how feasible, or even how sincere, those benevolent intentions really were when push came to shove.
And Zanzibar really brings that tension into sharp focus, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Britain was determined to stamp out the Muslim slave trade there.
Absolutely determined. And that trade wasn't just business. The source calls it a core prop sustaining the social system of Zanzibar.
So attacking the trade meant attacking the whole social structure.
Fundamentally, which forced Britain to get more and more involved, deeper and deeper into the Sultanate's internal affairs. At the same time, you had British Indian financiers and businessmen gaining huge economic influence on the island.
More British entanglement.
Definitely. Then, two major global events really accelerate things. First, the Suez Canal opens in 1869.
Huge game changer for shipping.
Massive. Suddenly, ships from Western Europe could avoid that long, dangerous trip around the Cape to get to India and the East. East Africa's coast becomes instantly more strategic.
Cuts down travel time dramatically.
Hugely. Then, just 4 years later, 1873, Britain uses its navy, its overwhelming sea power, to force Zanzibar to close its slave markets.
A direct application of force.
And the immediate result: The Sultan becomes utterly dependent on the Royal Navy just to maintain his authority. So by the 1870s, British power isn't just lurking, it's deeply embedded and assertive in East Africa.
And this is all happening right alongside the peak of the Industrial Revolution back in Europe.
Exactly. Britain needs markets for its goods, sources for raw materials, and with Suez open, the East African coast looks like a prime, strategically vital area for trade and imperial expansion.
The timing seems crucial. Everything converging.
It really does.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the period 1885 to 1890. The source calls this time more decisive than any other. This is when the scramble for Africa really gets formalized, right? Borders on maps.
Yes, the formal partition begins in earnest. And one surprising thing the source notes is how easily Britain and Germany, major rivals, actually reached agreements about East Africa. Relatively little fuss initially.
That is surprising. What about other players? Italy.
Italy was involved, yes. They were weaker, but had acquired Assab on the Red Sea and wanted an empire in the Horn of Africa, mainly for prestige. Because Italy was in the Triple Alliance with Germany, they had German sympathy.
Which put pressure on Britain.
Exactly. Britain felt it had to offer counter-bribes, diplomatic deals to keep Italy happy or aligned with British interests.
And Germany's leader, Bismarck? What was his take on East Africa?
Bismarck, being the pragmatist he was, apparently had limited interest beyond looking out for Karl Peter's German East African Company. He was happy to back Peter's treaties with local chiefs as long as it didn't cause a major fight with Britain.
So Germany wasn't pushing aggressively against Britain there, initially.
Not aggressively from Bismarck's perspective.
Yeah.
Britain actually had the biggest stake in East Africa, but its interests were complex. The source uses this great phrase, the involute diplomacy of position.
Involute diplomacy, what does that mean?
It means their moves in Africa were less about Africa itself and more about protecting their bigger imperial interests, India, primarily, and the Suez Canal route via Egypt. It was a global chess game.
Ah, so East Africa was a piece in a much larger puzzle.
Precisely. You had British missions in Uganda. You had William Mackinnon, the Scottish shipowner, trying to build his own trading empire inland from Mombasa towards Lake Victoria.
The Imperial British East Africa Company.
That's the one. He got a charter to compete with the Germans. But, and this is crucial, British politicians saw both the missionaries and Mackinnon's company as, well, expendable.
Really? Expendable?
That's the term used. The vital British interest was India. German control of the East African coast. That could threaten the sea lanes to India. German control of Uganda or the Upper Nile. That threatened Egypt and Suez.
So it all came back to protecting those core assets.
Absolutely. Which led to this paradox. Britain felt forced to invest more heavily in East Africa, which the source calls the least attractive of all colonial lots at auction, than in places with potentially more immediate economic gain.
Because the strategic risk was so high if someone else controlled it.
Exactly. That defensive strategic thinking dominated the partition diplomacy right up until 1898. It wasn't about grabbing the best real estate. It was about blocking rivals from threatening positions.
Fascinating. It wasn't a simple land grab.
Far from it. And specific dates become absolutely critical in cementing this map. The source highlights 1886 and 1890.
Okay, what happened in 1886?
Lord Salisbury, the British PM, made a clever move. To block potential German claims on Uganda, he recognized a German protectorate over coastal towns like Dar es Salaam and Pangani, and implicitly Witu.
So he conceded the coast to protect the interior.
In a sense, yes. In return, Britain got a provisional sphere of influence north of a line running from Wonga to Lake Victoria. A clear quid pro quo.
And Zanzibar, where did it fit in?
Zanzibar was already effectively under British control, but it became a full, formal British protectorate in 1890, and it controlled that 10-mile-deep coastal strip on the mainland.
Consolidating British power there.
Definitely. But the really big one was the Helgoland Treaty of 1890. By then, Salisbury knew Britain would stay in Egypt, making control of Uganda, the Nile's source, absolutely fundamental.
So a more permanent deal was needed.
Yes. The Helgoland Treaty drew a more definite line. Britain recognized a huge German protectorate stretching from Portuguese Mozambique up to Lake Nyasa, across to Lake Tanganyika, over to the Congo Free State border, but crucially, stopping short of Uganda.
So Uganda was kept out of the German sphere. What did Germany get in return?
They got Helgoland, a small island in the North Sea. Apparently, many Germans thought that was a better deal than Uganda anyway.
Interesting trade-off. An
Yeah.
island in Europe for potential territory in Africa.
It seems so. In return for that, Germany recognized a continuous British sphere north of the previous line, and very importantly, the British protectorate over Zanzibar. The source says this treaty virtually fixed the pattern of colonial East Africa.
The blueprint was set.
Pretty much. But even then, it wasn't completely finished. Which makes you ask, okay, what was still left to decide after such a major agreement?
Good question. What loose ends remained?
The source mentions several things that show how messy and ongoing this process was. Would Britain make its sphere a formal protectorate or a colony? What about the exact borders with the Congo Free State?
Defining those lines on the ground.
Right. And would the Congo give up a corridor of land to link Uganda, Egypt with Central Africa? And would France or Italy challenge Britain in the Egyptian Sudan?
So lots of potential flashpoints still.
Absolutely. It shows that even after the big deals were signed, the colonial map was still being actively negotiated and potentially contested. It wasn't neat and tidy.
Right. So the map is mostly drawn, the spheres agreed upon. Britain then starts actually establishing its protectorate, step by step.
Putting boots on the ground, setting up administration.
And the source says their administrative system started running strongly day by day. This is where we get into the machinery of control. Now, the source mentions the Marxist view that colonialism was basically a capitalist plot to enrich merchants.
With the colonial rulers just being employees of the rich elite.
Right. But the source immediately pushes back on that, saying British colonial governors rarely had any links with the instruments of production or finance.
Suggesting it wasn't quite that simple. The motives might have been more mixed, or the administrators came from a different class or background, military, gentry, etc.
It implies a more complex reality.
Yeah.
By the late 19th century, the British system had different categories, right?
Yes. Three main types. You had crown colonies, run directly by the Colonial Office in London, protectorates, mostly still under the Foreign Office then.
Reflecting their diplomatic origin.
Exactly. And thirdly, the chartered companies, like McKinnon's, supposedly under the Colonial Office, but often, as the source says, only loosely supervised at best. They had a lot of autonomy.
But regardless of the type, the man in charge on the ground was usually called the governor.
Generally, yes. The governor was responsible for the day-to-day running of the place.
And in East Africa, William McKinnon was a huge believer in this chartered company model, wasn't he? And railways.
Very much so. The source describes him vividly, combining evangelical fervor and British patriotism with a bitter hatred of Germany. Quite a character.
Sounds like it. And his tool was the Imperial British East Africa Company, chartered in 1889.
Right. And his biographer, John Galbraith, noted something fascinating about the company's investors.
Who were they?
The upper riches of Anglo-Scottish society, a real mix. Business interests, philanthropy, old money, public service figures. They formed a board that, Galbraith said, could command respect from any government. Some were even MPs.
Wow, so deeply connected at the highest levels. Business and politics intertwined.
Completely intertwined, which makes the next point even more striking.
Which is?
Despite all those connections and ambitions, the Imperial British East Africa Company was an economic failure. It had to surrender its charter in 1895.
A failure? Why, with all that backing?
The source lists clear reasons. One, East Africa just lacked an easily accessible source of wealth, no quick gold or diamonds. Two, it started with too little capital, an inadequate economic base.
Underfunded from the start.
It seems so. Three, it couldn't compete with the efficient Indian merchants already dominating coastal trade. Four, customs revenue wasn't enough to even pay for basic administration.
Couldn't cover its own costs.
Basically, no. And finally, any real agricultural development needed railways, which the company just couldn't afford to build.
So the grand vision hit harsh economic reality.
Yeah.
It really makes you question the idea that colonialism was always immediately profitable for the colonizers.
It certainly wasn't always the case, especially in these early stages, often required huge, risky investment. The company's actual administration was also pretty thin on the ground run from London, with just an agent general, a few superintendents in Africa.
A skeleton crew, really.
Relatively speaking, yes. They had a small police force, a small river fleet, but real power lay with McKinnon himself.
And after the company failed in 1895, what changed?
The British government had to step in more directly. Interestingly, the source notes about 10% of the officials in British East Africa before 1914 actually came from other colonies, South Africa, Nyasaland, Rhodesia.
Recycling experienced administrators.
Makes sense. And another fascinating detail. Queen Victoria's personal interest. She apparently wanted to see all the important messages and cared deeply about who got appointed as governor, wanted them independent of politics.
The Queen herself keeping a close eye.
She really did. And these governors, whether called resident, commissioner, whatever, they were the chief executives, appointed by the Queen, representing her, supervising everything. The source sums it up. The governor was all in all in his region. Immense power.
Running the whole show locally.
Pretty much. And they lived accordingly. The source mentions governors having huge domestic staffs, maybe up to 50 people. Major domo, stewards, chauffeurs, gardeners.
A sign of their status and the scale of the operation.
Absolutely. Towards the end of the century, Sir Charles Eliot was governor, and his secretary was Alfred Claude Hollis, Sir Claude. He's highlighted as making everything running smoothly.
An efficient administrator.
Very much so. Hollis had an interesting career. Started as a district commissioner at 23 in 1887. By 1902, he's running the secretariat. Later becomes resident of Zanzibar, governor of Trinidad and Tobago.
Quite the rise.
Indeed. And he was also an anthropologist, wrote books on the Nandi and Maasai, and the source notes he sided with the Negrophilists.
What did that mean back then?
It generally meant people who advocated for the rights and welfare of Black Africans, often opposing the more exploitative colonial policies. It shows there could be different personal views even within the administration itself. Not everyone was automatically prejudiced or exploitative in their personal philosophy.
So internal variations in attitude. That's important. Okay, pulling back again, what was the overall impact? The source says Britain dominated the region, influencing religion, race, class, nationality.
Everything, really. And the British themselves, well, they generally believed they'd created the world's best society, prosperous, stable, law-abiding. And these values shaped their attitudes towards Africans.
They saw themselves as bringing progress.
Largely, yes. The source states the bulk of British administrators were convinced that colonialism was an instrument of social reform, genuinely believing they were improving African society, bringing modernization, even if that view seems deeply problematic today.
Right. Conviction mistaken or not.
And there were tangible impacts, the source points to. The British protectorate wasn't just imposed, it was effective in establishing things. Railways, telegraphs, hospitals, schools, real infrastructure.
Things that changed daily life significantly.
Undeniably, but maybe even more fundamental, according to the source,
Yes.
were the new foodstuffs introduced, cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, these greatly improved African diets.
That's fascinating. A basic change with huge potential consequences for population and health.
Exactly. Often overlooked in the big political narratives. Now, the British had only made a little more than beginning in spreading their language, government ideas, religion. But their presence had another profound, maybe unintended long-term effect.
Which was?
British activity also made African nationalist movements in the 20th century.
The seeds of resistance sown by the system itself.
It's a common pattern in history, isn't it? External control fostering a sense of shared identity and a desire for self-determination among the colonized.
A powerful, perhaps inevitable reaction.
And connecting this to the present day, the source finishes by acknowledging the huge hostility towards the word colonialism now. The argument, as it summarizes, is that colonialism explains much of the wealth gap between rich and poor nations.
Gained at the expense of the poor.
Right, and that it bears blame not just for poverty, but for the stagnation of regions like East Africa, often labeled the underdeveloped world.
Yeah.
That critique remains incredibly potent today.
A heavy legacy, undeniably.
A very heavy legacy.
So today we've really journeyed deep into British colonialism in 19th century East Africa. We look at those early interests, the decline of Portugal, the scramble and the deals that carved up the map, and the administrative systems put in place. We've tried to unpack the motives, the contradictions, the impacts, both intended and unintended. As you look back over all this complex history, what really stands out to you?
What strikes me most is how this deep dive reveals that intricate web geopolitics, economics, even shifting ideas about humanitarianism, all weaving together, often in contradictory ways, to shape a continent's fate. The source really maps out that shift from a kind of hands-off trading presence to intense territorial control and detailed administration.
The layers are incredibly complex.
They really are, and it leaves me thinking about that final point. The source mentions how the British prided themselves on that role, the role of colonizer, believing in their mission. Yet, today, colonialism is viewed with such anger, blamed for so many problems.
It's a complete reversal in perspective.
Exactly. And what does that huge gap tell us about the ongoing difficulty of reconciling history, how people saw themselves then, with our modern understanding of justice, equality, and who bears responsibility for global inequalities? It's a tough knot to untangle.
It really is. A powerful question and a fitting thought to leave everyone with as we wrap up this deep dive, something to definitely mull over. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We genuinely hope this exploration has given you a richer, maybe more nuanced perspective on this absolutely pivotal time in history. Until next time.